evening and welcome. I'm Emily Welchel-DeFore and I am the director of the Folk Pottery Museum. Thank you for joining us tonight as we kick off our 20th anniversary year with Face Jugs, Where Did They Come From? This museum exists because of the vision and generosity of Dean and Kay Swanson. Their deep appreciation for folk pottery and for the people who make it led them to create something special, a place where this tradition can be preserved, studied, and shared with the public. What began as their passion has become the foundation for preserving Northeast Georgia's folk pottery heritage. Ms. Kay is no longer with us, but her influence is still very much felt here. In her honor, we continue to expand the educational side of our mission through the John Burrison Pottery Studio and our growing K-12 programming. Mr. Dean couldn't be here tonight with us, but Dean's commitment to this museum has never wavered. His vision, leadership, and continued support have helped guide us to where we are today. I hope you'll join me in thanking the Swansons and for all they have done to continue to do for this museum and for the folk pottery community.
Stuart and Chris Swanson. Is this still working? There we go. Try it again.
We're also grateful to Stuart and Chris Swanson for carrying that legacy forward and to our museum committee for their continued guidance and support. Yeah. As we look ahead, we're launching our first ever fund drive called Leave Your Mark, running April through June. This campaign will support our next chapter, enhancing the museum experience, caring for our collection, and expanding programs that connect this tradition to our community. If you'd like to be a part of that by leaving your mark, please pick up a postcard on your way out this evening. At the door. Face jugs are one of the most recognizable forms in Northeast Georgia pottery, sometimes loved and sometimes debated, but always worth understanding more deeply. We're especially grateful to Stan and Andy Clark for their support of this exhibit. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Burrison. For more than 60 years, John has taught folklore in the English department at Georgia State University, shaping generations of students and bringing scholarly attention to Southern folk traditions. His work on folk pottery is known internationally through books such as Brothers in Clay, From Mud to Jug, and Beautiful Clay, and among many others. As the founding curator of this museum and the leading authority on Georgia folk pottery, John has played a central role in preserving and interpreting this tradition for us all. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you, Emily. What am I going to talk to you about tonight? What would you like to hear? It's up to you. I'm supposed to be an authority on Georgia folk pottery, and if that's the case, how did that happen? Because when I moved to Georgia back in 1966, I knew absolutely nothing about pottery in general, and was just learning about Georgia as soon as I hit the ground here. The reason I'm talking about face jugs tonight is that it was the beginning of my journey that became an international journey looking at pottery traditions all over the world. But that journey started in Georgia and has not ended here. And it all began in, about 58 years ago. And it would have been 1968. The Smithsonian Institution had come down to Mossy Creek and started to make a film about the Metters pottery as one of the last old-fashioned folk pottery operations in the country. And I visited the Smithsonian's first Festival of American Folk Life in 1967, the previous year, in Washington. and bought my first Lanier Metters face jug. I think I paid $30 for it. And that sparked my curiosity about who made it and where it was made. And at the time, I had signed on to working with an organization called Georgia Mountain Arts, that some of you may be familiar with. And I made the mistake of volunteering to curate an exhibit of North Georgia folk crafts. And I collected for a couple of years with supposedly funding from the Georgia Council for the Arts, which I never saw a penny of. I was buying things out of my own pocket, and you can imagine that my salary in 1967, 68 was not great. And the one craft that I didn't know about and hadn't run into was pottery. I wasn't interested in it. In fact, I think I was a little afraid of it because it just seemed too complicated to me. And every old pot I saw, they all look exactly the same to my eye. Now, you collectors know that that would have had to change if I'm supposedly an authority on the subject. So in 1968, I was with a journalist with the Atlanta Constitution, and we were up in the mountains visiting people I had met, and we could come down through Mossy Creek in White County, southern White County, not far from here. And I asked him if it would be okay to visit the Metters Pottery to see what was going on there. I'd heard that Lanier's father, Cheever, had died, and I was curious to see if he was still carrying on the craft after that. And I remember it was a March day, rainy, smoke coming out of the tar paper covered shop that Lanier had built to replace the log shop that Metters Pottery had started with, only the chimney of which still stood. And we pulled into the driveway. Lanier heard us, came out, greeted us, invited us in to the shop, and he had just unloaded the first load of pots from his new kiln, which incidentally is pronounced kill, I learned, here in the South, as it is in England. He had built that kiln out of bricks recycled from his father's old kiln, which had fallen in after the Smithsonian filming. And he had committed himself to becoming a full-time potter, not working yet part-time jobs as he had been doing and helping his dad when he had a chance. So I walked into the shop, and there on the shelves, drying, was a whole new batch of face jugs looking at me, talking to me. And one of them said, "Oh, there's John Burrison. He's going to tell our story." Now, of course, one of the jugs didn't tell me that, but Lanier gave me a clue that he understood that I was going to be his historian, if you will, and gave me two pieces. His father's little brown jug, which is on display here, the last thing that Cheever had made before he died, and one of the two laser jugs that Lanier had made. The other one kind of destroyed in the firing process. And suddenly I realized that maybe I was the person to write the story of Georgia folk pottery, starting with what I was learning about the Metters pottery and Mossy Creek, and then learning about all the other potters who had worked in Georgia. A total of about 450 traditional potters, folk potters, who had been learning the craft from their family and their neighbors, generation to generation. But it was the encounter with those face jugs in Lanier's shop on my first visit that really got me intrigued. But everybody seems to be intrigued by face jugs. Where did they come from? What do they mean? To the makers? To the owners? Why are studio potters trained in school also making humanoid vessels like this? Are they influenced by the older tradition that you see in this part of the country? Well, a review of the story, as I've come to understand it, should make clear that the answers are anything but simple. While these sculpted humanoid vessels are referred to generically as face jugs, I like to use the word people pots because some of them are other vessel forms besides jugs. I mean, how do we define a jug? Well, it's a container for liquid with a narrow neck and a single or double loop handle. But there are also humanoid pitchers, like the example at the left from antebellum Virginia, or are full-bodied figural vessels like the one made by William Grindstaff of Knoxville, Tennessee, about 1890 on the right. Early people pots from the South survive, but information about them is so scant, or at least it was in the early days of my research, that later theories about origin and meaning are at best educated guesswork. These examples, some of the earliest from the South, were made during the Civil War by enslaved African American potters of Edgefield District, South Carolina. Created in a white-owned shop using the European technology of the potter's wheel and kiln and the European jug form, they're coated with wood ash or lime-based alkaline glazes that are probably Asian in inspiration. Yet the tendency has been to argue an African origin for them. That was the case with ceramics historian Edwin Atlee Barber, the first to write about face jugs at the start of the 20th century. Many of the South Carolina examples can be attributed to slave potters working at the Palmetto Firebrick Works, founded in 1862 at Bath in Aiken County, part of the old Edgefield District, based on Barber's communication with the shop's owner, Thomas Davies. As Barber put it, quote, "These curious objects possess considerable interest as representing an art of the Southern Negroes, and we can readily believe that the modeling reveals a trace of Aboriginal art as formerly practiced by the ancestors of the makers on the Dark Continent, that is, Africa." Face jugs are further associated with the black population in this published image on an 1882 stereoscope card. It was taken by photographer James Palmer in his studio at Aiken, South Carolina, which lies in Edgefield District, where the illustrated face jug certainly was made. With its stirrup handle and angled off-center spouts, the pot, like the faceless South Carolina example at the left, is known in the South as a monkey jug, a type of water or field jug, supposedly named from an Afro-Caribbean term relating to thirst. Such jugs were common in Africa. The example at right is Nigerian, as well as Mediterranean Europe. In Spain, there are actually 3 museums devoted specifically to this ceramic form, the field jug. So the monkey jug form itself could indeed be an African contribution to Southern folk pottery. But is applying a face onto a clay vessel, such as these slave-made Edgefield District monkey jugs, also an African idea? Well, there were, in fact, humanoid ceramic traditions in West and Central Africa, the locus for the slave trade. For example, the Azande people on the border of southern Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo made beautifully detailed head bottles like the one at left, while in northern Congo, Mangbeto potters made palm wine jugs portraying elite women with their elaborate hairdos. However, I found no indication that such African vessels were made before the 1880s, and so would have been too late to have influenced South Carolina slaves. An alternative theory of African influence is the possible media switch to clay from the wooden-bodied power figures called Nkisi Nkondi, used by Congo people to receive magical help from the spirit world. A fresh infusion of African culture to Edgefield District occurred in 1858 with the Congo slaves from the illegal slave ship Wanderer, at least one of whom, actually 2 of whom, in this photograph, Taro, who was given the English name Romeo Thomas, shown at right in this 1908 photo while in Edgefield District, was working at Thomas Davies Pottery in 1863 and may have been the person responsible for adapting the idea of the Nkisi to the medium of clay. But this is all speculation. We don't have, they're just missing links in the story. Given their often angry expressions and Negroid features, these antebellum face jugs might have been nonverbal expressions of protest against enslavement, perhaps applying the African American belief system known as conjure by functioning as mojos or magical charms to protect against abuse by slave owners. I should point out here that, there we go, that while the American tradition of face vessels has been concentrated in the South, they are known elsewhere in the United States. A notable group of Midwestern face jugs was made at White Cottage, Ohio, by a white potter, John Dollings, at the workshop of his brother-in-law, Charles Stein. Dollings is known to have made at least 7 face field jugs, one of which was signed and dated in 1881. Their racial character is defined by Negroid features, the dark brown Albany slip glaze contrasting with unglazed eyeballs and teeth that I think sometimes were painted in with white paint. Complicating the pursuit of origins for American people pots is the fact that humanoid vessels are nearly universal among clay-working societies. How can we explain this? Potters' awareness of the corporeal character of their vessels is revealed by the anatomical terms they use to describe the parts of a pot. Is it any wonder then that the potters the world over have seen clay as a sort of mirror, a reflection of their humanity, and have exploited its plastic nature to sculpt it into a human likeness? We begin our excursion into humanoid vessels, leaving the American South, with these 15th century Native American effigy pots from the Mississippian or mound building period. The one at left from Arkansas, too early to have influenced the 19th century Southern face jug tradition. So I think we can eliminate the idea of Native American influence on the later Southern face jug tradition. Latin America has its share of humanoid clay vessels, like the Mayan head jar at left from Guatemala, dating to around 800, and the four-face jar from the pre-Columbian Mogollon culture town of Casas Grandes in Chihuahua, Mexico, dating to about 1400. Portrait jugs with stirrup handles representing high-status males of Peru's Moche culture date to the early centuries of the Christian era. While today, as a living tradition, female Shipibo Conibo natives of Peru's Amazon rainforest make face jars for water and chicha, or maize beer. To extend the global distribution of humanoid vessels beyond the Americas, we begin with Egypt, where figural jugs of Nile clay depicting females, like this mother and child, were made about 1400 BC during the New Kingdom. The bearded face on the much later two-handled jar from Wadi Sarga, a Byzantine Coptic monastery, Christian community, dates to the 6th century AD. Could it represent Jesus? Moving to Europe and beginning with ancient Greece, the vessel at left, which I've named George W. You're getting it, are you? Now missing its pour spout, dates to the late Bronze Age of about 1300 BC, while the two-faced jug pairing an African woman with a Greek woman, inscribed kalos, the Greek word for beautiful, is from Athens and dates to about 520 BC. Etruscan potters of pre-Roman Italy sometimes added a molded face to their black pottery, like this jug and associated lid of about 550 BC from Chiusi in Tuscany. The later Roman lead-glazed face jug dates to the 1st century BC. In France, there were a number of local traditions of figural jugs, both early and late. The lead-glazed example at left from La Chapelle des Pots in Saintonge dates to the 1600s. The ash-glazed stoneware vinegar dispenser, shaped as another well-to-do lady, was created in the 1840s by Marie Talbot of La Borne in Berry. And the lead-glazed butcher by Louis Leopold Fouillant of Sartre-Prevel is from his series on local occupations and dates to the 1880s. As in France, the impulse to humanize clay emerged several times in England. First, with cremation urns by Roman potters there. Then in the Middle Ages, with figural jugs like the lead-glazed example of about 1300 from Kingston upon Thames in Surrey. Finally, flourishing as the Toby jug, a slip-cast character drinking vessel with the rise of Staffordshire's pottery industry in the late 1700s. The popularity of early examples, like the one at left by Ralph Wood the Younger, led to many spin-offs, some just heads rather than full figures, like the handcrafted salt-glazed stoneware face pitcher from London, which I found on an auction site and purchased, the only successful auction bid I've ever made. A probable German influence on American face vessels was the Bartmannskrug, or bearded man jug, sometimes called a Bellarmine in England. A salt-glazed stoneware jug with a bearded face molded on the neck and shoulder, made from the 16th through the 18th century. The example at left is from late 1500s Cologne. The one at right was made a century later at nearby Fechen, mid-1600s, that one. One of America's first stoneware potters was John Ramey, who in 1735 immigrated from Rhineland, Germany to New York City. His descendants continued to make stoneware in New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, and were responsible for some of the earliest Euro-American face vessels, likely evolved from the German Bartmann tradition. The face pitcher at left was made in Philadelphia in 1838 by John's great-grandson, Henry Harrison Ramey. The two-faced example at right was made 20 years later by Henry or his son Richard. Where the Remeys and other northern potters encountered the African and Mediterranean field jug form is unknown, as it was not made in Germany or Britain. The lead-glazed earthenware face field jug at left is attributed to white potter Thomas Chandler in the late 1820s when he was in Baltimore, Maryland. He likely worked with the Rameys there before moving to South Carolina about 1835. The signed Happy Face ash-glazed stoneware field jug was made by Chandler when he had settled in Edgefield and adopted the alkaline glazed stoneware tradition there, made by him about 1850, a decade before many of the slave-made pieces from Thomas Davies pottery, and about the time his portrait photo was taken. One researcher believes the second example was Chandler's personal drinking jug, raising the issue of the uses and meanings of early people pots made by white potters in the South. Take, for example, this trio. The field jug at left, with a lime-based alkaline glaze coating all but the face, is inscribed with the word Long. Now, James Long was a pioneer Middle Georgia potter who may have started in Edgefield before migrating to Washington County, Georgia, our state's first stoneware center. And by 1826, James Long had established himself further west in Crawford County, just west of Macon. If Long on this jug is his signature, then it would have been made in South Carolina or Georgia. The carefully modeled alkaline glazed figural jug in the middle was made by John Lehman at Rock Mills, Alabama in the late 1870s, and is thought to represent an African American, perhaps a legislator elected during Reconstruction. If so, the possible political message is reinforced by the hoop earrings suggesting a pirate. The intended meaning of such pieces can be obscure to us today. The inscription on the Albany slip-glazed example of about 1900 at the right, signed by Jesse Ham of Perry County, Alabama, reads, "Drink my blood." Is this a reference to the Eucharist? And is the bearded face meant to portray Jesus? If so, perhaps this was the potter's critique of more formal Christian churches. This lime-glazed face jug is attributed to Crawford County's Eddie Avery, in Middle Georgia. In a letter to me, his daughter, Lucille Wills, offered this rare insight into the social context of face jugs in the 1920s. Papa made face jugs for sale. It tickled the man that bought them to think they had something funny looking to put their whiskey in. Others bought them for inside the home decorations and to sit on the porch where they could be seen. My mama, Bertha Pender Averett, made the faces on the jugs. The teeth were made out of broken up pieces of white china. The face jugs looked scary to me as a child, so I particularly stayed away from them. Here we're getting into the issue of gender and how women and men, at least 30 or 40 or more years ago, were responding to these curious vessels. Potters of the Brown family, originally from Jugtown in west central Georgia, have been making face jugs for generations. The Albany slip glazed example with a lizard modeled on the forehead, possibly charged more for that extra lizard, is from the Brown pottery of Howells Mills in northwest Atlanta. The inscription on the throat, "Just Grace and me and the baby makes three," is based on a stanza from 1927 hit My Blue Heaven, as some of you may remember, and was made soon thereafter as a presentation piece. But the private joke is lost on us. We don't know the whole story. Brothers Davis and Javan Brown, of the same extended family, left Georgia in 1925 to establish Brown's Pottery at Arden, North Carolina. There they made big devil jugs to attract business customers, like this unglazed and painted example made by Davis Brown about 1930 for an Asheville hardware store. The humor inherent in some Anglo-Southern face jugs is illustrated in this pose by Catawba Valley, North Carolina potter Harvey Reinhardt in the late 1930s, when they were being made in larger numbers as novelties and sold to tourists in North Carolina. Reinhardt may have learned about face jugs from Casey Metters, who left Mossy Creek, Georgia in 1921 to settle at Catawba, North Carolina. As a teenager, Berlin Craig worked for neighbor Reinhardt and later bought his operation to become one of America's most famous 20th century folk potters, kind of North Carolina's answer to Lanier Metters. His 3-gallon face jug of about 1980 is decorated with melted glass, an older Catawba Valley technique he revived. Kim Ellington is one of several current Catawba Valley potters inspired by Berlin Craig and his work. The continuing recent tradition reveals further developments in the shifting meaning of Southern people pots. Lanier Metters of Mossy Creek revitalized the face jug tradition in the 1960s, opening a collector's market for them and establishing the face jug as an icon of Southern folk art. He made several thousand in his 25-year career. Here he was in 1975 signing his two-faced jugs. He had been watching the Watergate hearings on TV. You remember those? Nixon and so on. And that inspired, seeing the Watergate hearings inspired him to call these two-faced jugs politician jugs. Inheriting the traditional hand skills of his father, Cheever, who made only a small number of very basic face jugs, and inspired by the artistry of his mother, Ari, Lanier experimented with sculpting and individualizing his face jugs, creating such departures as devil head jack-o'-lanterns and wheel-thrown wig stands. This is a trio spanning the years 1968 to 1974. Now, Lanier died in 1998, but other members of his family have carried on. This is his cousin Cleet Metters with a devil jug he made, but Cleet is not with us anymore either. He died in 2023. Lanier's neighbor, Lynn Craven, took up pottery by apprenticing with the Fergusons of Gillsville in Hall County, Georgia, after learning of her own family's long Southern history in clay. Of course, you know that the Craven potteries are still active at Gillsville. But not raised in the tradition, she was freer to exercise her creative spirit, as with this Indian owl totem jug. But again, unfortunately, Lynn died in 2011. The Fergusons have a 6 generations pottery history, starting in Edgefield District, South Carolina. The Devil Field Jug is the work of Stanley Ferguson, who maintains the family workshop today at Gillsville. Stanley's dad, the late Bobby Ferguson, continued the brightly colored glazes developed by his father, Pat. The first known North Georgia potter to make face jugs was Charlie Ferguson, Pat's father, and grandson of Edgefield-trained Charles H. Ferguson. Like later generations, Charlie's face jugs had 2 shapes, the monkey or field jug form and the more standard jug form, like this example of about 1900, unglazed except for Albany slip, highlighting the hair and eyes. Charlie's face jugs can't be directly linked to those of antebellum South Carolina, since his grandfather came to Georgia from Edgefield before face jugs are known to have been made there. The Hewells of Gillsville are related to the Fergusons through marriage. Will Hewell probably learned to make face jugs from his brother-in-law, Charlie Ferguson, and liked to work up at Mossy Creek, where these Albany slip-glazed examples of both jug forms probably were made in the early 1900s. Encouraged by the success of his friend Lanier Metters, 5th generation potter Chester Hewell revived his own family's face jug tradition in the 1980s. The influence of these 2 families then is circular, since Lanier's father, Cheever, had learned about face jugs from Will Hewell, Chester's great uncle. One of Chester's innovations involved the size of his face jug. He challenged himself to make some of the largest and smallest. The wheel-thrown miniature sitting on his pocket watch there on the ground is less than an inch tall. Hewell's pottery of Gillsville is now in the hands of Chester's sons, Matthew and Nathaniel. And Matthew is shown sculpting face jugs in 1992. Returning to the matter of origins, my research suggests that Southern face vessels are neither clearly African nor European in background, but perhaps a synthesis of both sources, reinterpreted in the United States with changes in meaning over time. As for the meaning of people pots by today's folk potters, they're a major source of income from the collector's market. Some of you, while continuing to serve as a vehicle for individual creative expression, as they have worldwide for thousands of years. These are Neolithic people pots, the new Stone Age from China, dating to about 2000 BC. Well, okay, that's about it. Complicated. If we could have the house lights back on, you might have a question or two that I may or may not be able to answer.
If you do have a question, raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you, okay? Any questions from the audience for John?
You have to speak loudly.
Anyone have any questions?
Oh, come on.
Come on. You got John Burrison here.
There's a question back here. Microphone coming.
Hi, thank you so much. This was just fascinating. I was just curious, and this just is my own assumptions, are there any sort of superstitions related to face jugs? Like, that they hold spirits, or I think you touched on that a little bit with the African jugs, but I would just like to hear, with the ones here in Georgia and North Carolina, any superstitions related to those?
Well, the problem there is that nobody has interviewed the people who use them. So we don't have a direct answer to your question. We don't know. We can only speculate. And it's easy to speculate. But I suspect that there was a spiritual element in coming out of the belief system, at least of the African American potters who made these during the antebellum period and into the early 20th century in Edgefield District. I think their attitude, their approach to the face jug is a very different one from those of the white potters who worked here in Northeast Georgia, for whom face jugs were more of a comical thing, a humorous thing, a kind of joke for men. This was what I call the male aesthetic of the ugly. The idea that the uglier you make something, the funnier it is. For men. Now for women, at least in my early visits to the Metters Pottery, women would walk into Lanier's shop and see those face jugs, and they would say, "Oh, I could never live with these." But I'll bet now women are collecting them and living with them, just as men collectors are. So I don't really have the satisfying answer that you might be looking for.
Okay, that was good, thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Surely.
Yeah, I had a question relating to her question.
Okay.
In West Africa, I know that they use grave markers that were jugs, and they were kind of open, and that was to let the spirits come out, ancestral. Is there any relation with the grave markers from West Africa?
Yeah, there were traditions in West Africa, like the Wiso of Nigeria, one of the neighboring countries of Nigeria, that you prayed to ancestral spirits at these shrines, which there were humanoid vessels representing ancestors, and that was a way you got help from your ancestors. But there's no indication that they were early enough to have influenced what was going on here in the South during the antebellum period. Those were late 19th century or early 20th century, as were the clay, the other humanoid vessels made in Africa. Now, I'm not telling you that all the research for Africa has been done. And so there's more to learn about that part of the story, I think. But again, I think there is some kind of spiritual element to the meaning of the African American examples. Maybe a very subtle kind of underground way coming from the African belief systems that they were rooted in. But things change as you come across the water, and so those African ideas may have become Americanized and expressed differently than they would have been back in Africa. So I don't know, I don't have the answers to that part of the story. I wish I did. I keep saying if I have a time machine, I think my first trip would be to Edgefield District, South Carolina, to talk to people like David Drake, the amazing enslaved potter who inscribed his own poetry on his pots and made some of the biggest pieces of folk pottery during the antebellum period. I would visit David Drake, number one on my list, and ask the questions that I have. And I have many questions that have been unanswered. There have been wonderful studies of people like Dave recently. Leonard Todd wrote a book about Dave called Carolina Clay that tells as close to the full story of him as can be known, at least when Todd was researching and writing that book. And Todd is the descendant, it turns out, of two of the white owners of Dave at two different times in Edgefield District. And when he discovered that, he was inspired to study, to research in his own family and elsewhere the story of David Drake. But as far as the other potters who might have made the African American face vessels, we have very little information so far, which is sad. We don't have a photograph of David Drake, although he lived in a time of photography. I think it will turn up at some point. And there are clues that he may have made some face jugs himself, face vessels. High Museum of Art has a great big umbrella stand with a really ugly face on it that is attributed now to Dave. Or at least he had a part in the making of it. Other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, John, as a collector, it's been intriguing to see the women kind of stepping out in the whole across the board of making and selling. The art history has gone absolutely wild in so many directions. What's the earliest women influence in working pottery face jug?
There were very few women potters until Ari Mitters, really.
So that would be the earliest, you think?
I would say, no, not the earliest. The earliest was a member of the Ferguson family, Catherine Ferguson.
Recent face jug.
Oh, I don't know about face jugs. I have absolutely no knowledge of her ever making face jugs. And Ari Mitters did make face jugs, and they're very distinctive. And then Grace Huell made them. And now there are members of some of the other families who are making them, women. But back when I started visiting potters in the late 60s, the idea of women making face jugs was unthinkable, basically. It just wasn't in their minds. So things have changed. And how have they changed? Well, the women's liberation movement made a big difference in terms of gender roles and what is appropriate for men and what is appropriate for women. And it's not just in the pottery tradition, but it's in all of the crafts. There was a time when you would never consider a woman being a blacksmith. And there was a time when you would never consider a man being a quilter. That has changed. and it's changed since the 1960s for the most part. Other thoughts, questions?
John, in your presentation, you show the evolution of the pottery, the face jug, face use in jugs. In this part of the country, jugs were, as I understand it, used for practical purposes, for transporting molasses and the like.
Whiskey.
And whiskey, of course, I didn't want to say that. But the face element came into the pottery around here, the southeast, as a result of somebody, in theory, finding out that tourists reacted much more favorably to buying these jugs with faces on them, and so it was an economic decision that created the evolution of the face jug. Would you comment on that?
Well, that was certainly the case later on. Initially, you had potters like Charlie Ferguson and Will Hewell. This was before there was much tourism in this part of the country. That was early 1900s. And so I'm not sure that's the answer to explain why suddenly potters were putting faces on clay vessels. But certainly that became the case as tourists began to come in large numbers. And I think that's the reason that in North Carolina, face jugs also became highly collectible, particularly after Berlin Craig was brought to the attention of the public and to collectors, and Harvey Reinhardt before him. And you had, it's been documented, people coming from the coast to central North Carolina to get away from the heat in the summer, and there were estates in the Piedmont area where these potters were located, where people could stay to escape the mosquitoes and so on. And I think the tourism element began to explain the proliferation of face vessels among those potters. Before that, I think it was just a matter of just human instinct, curiosity. And if you read the literature about face vessels, you have writers talking about an end of the day piece. Potters have been throwing undecorated utilitarian pitchers or jugs or crocks all day, and they're exhausted. But at the end of the day, they've got some clay left over, and it turns into a kind of fun exercise before they close the shop down. That's possible. I don't know, because I wasn't there. But we've raised a lot of questions, but not that many answers. Other thoughts?
John, tell everybody about the face jug that you're wearing around your neck.
This little face jug is in the style of the slave-made Edgefield face jugs. And it was made up in North Carolina by Billy Ray Hussey, who with his wife Susan runs a Southern Folk Pottery Collectors auction operation. And I went up there to give a talk and was persuaded to enter a auction for pots that he had just pulled out of his kiln. And I got an early number, and I looked at the pots he had set up to buy. He wasn't giving them away, he was selling them. And I saw this little guy, and I said, well, that's nice. And it's not that expensive. I'm going to buy it. But it's interesting in that the glades he learned about from D.X. Gordy, who was a Georgia potter, who came out of a pottery tradition in Middle Georgia, down in Meriwether County. And they had invited, at his operation in North Carolina, DX to come up and sell and talk about some of his work. DX was the brother of Bill Gordy, who worked at Cartersville, those two brothers. And DX chatted with Billy Ray and told him about a glaze that he had experimented with from the ashes from orange trees. And so Billy Ray got a hold of some orange wood and burned it and used them for the glaze in this little jug. And he also has melted glass decoration from bottles, little pieces of them, put in the kiln and then melted down the sides of the jug. And he uses two kinds of clay, white kaolin clay for the teeth and eyes, and his regular stoneware clay for the rest of the jug. So it's a pretty carefully made, elaborate piece. Now, the slave-made examples were also carefully made, and I've seen early descriptions of them as being crude. They're not crude at all. They're beautifully made. They're made, again, of two different clays. The potters who made them had control over the whole process. Some of them came out a little strange. The eyeballs rolling around inside the eye sockets, for example, rather than stuck in there. But those enslaved potters knew what they were doing, believe me. They were skilled. And they wouldn't have been trained for a very long period. There's evidence now that there were enslaved potters making face vessels before the Thomas Davies pottery, that going back to the 1850s, not the 1860s. So there were black potters making face vessels at other pottery sites in Edgefield District, supposedly, according to the scholars who should know about that. I'm not a researcher of the Edgefield District in any depth. My research has concentrated in Georgia and now on a very superficial level kind of spread out to the rest of the world. So I haven't spent a lot of time lately in Northeast Georgia. So opportunities like here, coming back to this part of the state is always something to look forward to. I haven't stopped being interested in the Georgia pottery tradition and this part of the state where it is still a living tradition. But it's just that I needed to grow, as we all do. And my way of doing that was to read extensively about pottery traditions all over the world. My favorite places in the world to study traditional pottery now are Japan and China, because China had done just about everything ceramically, with one exception. Unlike the Germanic tradition, they didn't have a salt glaze for their stoneware, whereas the Germans developed that. But just about everything else you can think about, the Chinese did, and they did it centuries ago. They made the first alkaline glazes, the first ash and lime-based glazes. Centuries before the Han Dynasty, centuries before the time of Christ, they were making glazes like our Southern folk potters came to use in the 19th century and are still using. The Japanese, wonderful stuff, I love it. But I still love Georgia folk pottery. I haven't stopped loving the tradition that belongs in our state. Other thoughts? Questions? Yes?
Are there many potters, and especially
here in our area who still dig their own clay?
Yes, there are some. You'll get a range of the technology that they're using now. Some of them dig their own clay. Some of them buy clay from processors, people who are doing digging on a large scale with backhoes and so on. Some of them use an electric powered wheel. Some of them still use a foot powered wheel. Some of them make their own glazes. Some of them use commercial glazes. But what makes a folk potter is that a lot of what they're doing is learned from contact with other traditional potters. And so you're passing on designs, you're passing on methods of making from one person to another. Okay?
One note to all the collectors in the room, if you're not familiar with Campbell Auction House, I went to see the jug that he has. He's got a new to our auction Edgefield jug. It's the prettiest one I've ever been in the presence of.
Mm-hmm.
It looks so beautiful. The
Mhm.
glaze and all the features are so well done.
Yeah, that's
Beautiful.
the point I was making. They are carefully made. They're not sloppily made, believe me. Okay?
Hey, John. So, as an advocate for the traditional folk pottery scene, what are you thinking about doing to encourage traditional potters to come out of the woodworks or potters to take on the traditional side and carry it on? Because the tradition is dying.
I would answer that by saying, I've done pretty much all I can do already. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but believe me, I'm not going to be in this world too many more years longer. And it's up to you guys to carry on the research work that I've done. This museum certainly is part of the encouragement. And there are young people here in the audience who are learning things and getting ideas for their own work. And those will be passed on to the next generation. Remember that when I came to Georgia and started visiting potters like Lanier Metters and the Hewells, that's the only place where traditional pottery was being made. Those two families, maybe a half a dozen people total. Now there are somewhere between 20 and 30 traditional potters active in Georgia, and most of them concentrated in this part of Georgia, northeast Georgia. That's good. That's a difference. But it will never be a popular culture phenomenon, I don't think. It will always remain a kind of smaller aspect of the culture, but an important one and worth studying and worth supporting. Now, the encouragement for the younger generation to pick up the tradition and carry it on isn't for me to do. That's not my job. Now, your job is that. You are the collectors. You are the people who are interested in your family history, particularly if you have a pottery family. So I'm passing the torch on to you all, basically. Because I've got other things I need to do. Like teach the remaining classes that I've got in my schedule. And other kinds of research that I'm doing. What I'm doing now, just to give you a hint, is I've got a graduate research assistant, not in my department, not in the English department, but in the Heritage Preservation Department, who is interested in particular in Atlanta architecture. And she is from Iran. Think about that. Now, most of her family has left Iran and have moved to Turkey to get away from all the stuff that's going on in that country. But we are attempting to research the decorative architectural terracotta on 1900s era buildings in downtown Atlanta, like the Hurt building, which is just a couple of blocks from Georgia State. And figuring out where those baked clay tiles were made. Of course, there was a big terracotta company in Atlanta called Pellegrini and Castleberry. And there were terracotta companies in places like New York City, where the people managing the construction of those buildings and spending money to do that, bringing terracotta ornaments for the exterior of their buildings from North Carolina, or were they using local companies like Pellegrini and Castleberry? That's what we're exploring, which is very different from, what we all have been talking about this evening. But that's where I am at the very moment.
Are you familiar with the examples that are in Athens then, of the terracotta tile?
I am not.
There are.
Well, I would expect that, and I would expect companies working with clay industrially, like those in the Milledgeville area and along the Piedmont, the Fall Line area especially, to produce things like that. But I can only do so much, and so I'm kind of focusing on where I live. And these buildings are like 2 blocks from where my office is, so I don't have to get out hundreds of miles to. Okay? Are you satisfied?